Okay, so I'm just going to start. We acknowledge the traditional territory upon which the conference is being hosted. For many thousands of years, the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, I'm going to be bad at pronouncing these, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas, the Michi-Sagig of the Credit have sought to walk gently on this land. This territory is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. This acknowledgement signals our desire to speak a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based on honor and deep respect, and is a starting point to remind us all to enact this work in our personal and professional lives. Now I'm just going to present our esteemed presenters. So Jen Baker, part of Hamilton Naturalists Club, is the lead on the Pollinator Paradise Project that gives the community the tools to create network of pollinator habitats across the city. Jen also creates and maintains a series of habitats in parks across the city. So welcome, Jen. And Briann Dorin, pursuing her passion for wildlife conservation and environmental stewardship, Briann Dorin began a doctoral program at York University studying native bee conservation. As an activist and university teaching assistant, Briann has continuously developed her pedagogy through workshops, certificate programs, and community involvement, including volunteering with the Pollinator Paradise Project. So welcome, Briann, and take it away, presenters.
Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now. So welcome, I am Briann, and me and Jen will be presenting on the Pollinator Paradise Project, which again is a community collaboration to protect Hamilton, Ontario's native pollinators. So first, I just want to quickly talk about what exactly is a pollinator and why are they important. So a pollinator is anything that transfers pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, which is called the pistil. So here we have the filament in the anther. The top of this is packed with pollen, and the pollen needs to get down the stigma and style and reach the ovules in order to fertilize that plant. So this is needed for sexual reproduction of plants and is needed to produce fruits, seeds, and young plants. So some plants will be self-pollinating, where that pollen can get to the spot it needs to get to on its own. Other plants, the pollen is carried to the correct spot, either on the same flower or a different flower by wind or water. And then lastly, some plants require insects or animals to move this pollen. So one study from 2011 estimated that the proportion of flowering plants that are animal pollinated is about 87.5%. So a huge percentage of our flowering plants do require animals to move that pollen around in order to fertilize the plant. Another study looking specifically at food crops and how much the animal pollination is needed for that found that the fruit, vegetable, or seed production from 87 of the leading global food crops is dependent upon animals to pollinate. So these animal pollinators are important for our native ecosystems and our natural flowering plants, but also extremely important for the foods that we as humans eat. And so when we talk about native pollinators, and usually people have heard of the bee crisis, the bee declines, the pollinator declines, a lot of people often think that we're talking about honeybees. And usually this is associated with colony collapse disorder, which became big about 10 years ago, a big concern. But when we are talking about native pollinator declines in North America, we are not talking about honeybees because they're not native to here. They come from Europe. They didn't evolve here with our native ecosystems and our native plants. And instead, they've actually been shown to be possibly very detrimental to our native pollinators and our native bees. And this is because they can outcompete our native pollinators for the flowers that they need to eat. So these animal pollinators will visit these flowers in order to eat the pollen and or nectar. That's their main food source. And when you have these huge European honeybee colonies made up of thousands and thousands of bees in an area, they can really outcompete with our native pollinators for those flowers. Secondly, they can transfer diseases to our native bees. So honeybee colonies can have a variety of different diseases that are detrimental to the honeybee health that can actually be transferred to our native bees, and then they are detrimental to their health as well. There's also a high variation in beekeeper ability and capacity. So when people hear about bee declines and they think, oh, I'm going to start a honeybee hive in my backyard to try and save the bees, the issue is that if you don't have the right information and tools and resources available, you could end up having a lot of disease spread in your own hive, and that can then be spread to not only our native bees, but other people's honeybees that are out foraging on those same flowers. And then lastly, honeybees are not at risk of extinction. So they're not listed as at risk or of special concern on any kind of provincial or federal listing. And there is a quote from Dr. Jeff Ollerton, who is a pollination ecologist, who said that keeping hives to save the bees is like keeping chickens to save the birds. So we usually see honeybees as more of an agricultural commodity rather than any kind of native animal that we need to protect. So when we talk about native pollinators, this is what we're talking about. So this is a really great poster from the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and it kind of highlights just that huge diversity of native pollinators that we do have here in Canada. So there are birds such as hummingbirds, butterflies like the monarch, different moth species. Moths are actually one of our most diverse insect groups. Of course, many different types of bees you can see all around here. Beetles, flies, wasps, all of these organisms have a role in pollination of our flowering plants. And this diversity of pollinators also represents a diversity of the preferred flowers that they want to forage on, where they nest, where they overwinter, the times of year that they're active, the times of day that they're active, how far they travel, whether they're migrating across many countries or staying really close to their nest site. There is a lot of diversity within our native pollinators that we need to account for and protect. And this is because our native pollinators are declining. So this has been shown for many species globally that pollinators have been declining due to several factors. And so the key threats that face our pollinators are habitat loss and fragmentation. So this is loss of those flowering plants that they rely on, as well as loss of nesting sites or overwintering sites. Climate change is a huge one. So these native pollinators that have co-evolved with the plants that they feed on are now that relationship, that evolutionary relationship is being severed by climate change. If the flower is blooming at a different time as when the bee's out, that can of course have negative impacts on both. Pesticide exposure is another huge threat facing our pollinators. A lot of people have probably heard about neonicotinoids, which are a group of pesticides that can actually be found in traces in the nectar and pollen from flowers. And so of course, anything feeding on the pollen and nectar is also consuming that pesticide. But there are many different types of pesticides, fungicides that have been shown to negatively impact different pollinator species. And then lastly, like we just talked about, any kind of competition or disease spread with managed pollinators like European honeybees. And in Ontario, we do have many species of pollinators at risk that are actually listed on the Ontario Endangered Species Act. So we have different bumblebees like the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, the rusty patch bumblebee, and the yellow-banded bumblebee are all listed as some form of at risk. The monarch butterfly is special concern, the mottled dusky wing, and there are many others. And you can see here just a bit of an overview of what this kind of looks like, what these declines look like. So looking at the data and distribution of individual species, we can really see just how much they've declined. So this one bumblebee in the UK, you can see it has been found historically all over the UK. And then in recent years, it's only been able to be found in a really small geographic area. And we're seeing a similar situation here in North America with that rusty patch bumblebee. Used to be found where this dark gray polygon is, and now we're finding it in a much narrower range at much lower numbers. So Jen, I'll pass it over to you to introduce the project.
Thanks, Bree. Hi, everybody. So I'm here today because I wanted to share some of our Pollinator Paradise work, and kind of how this initiative got going and some of the great success that we've had. So the partnership, it's a partnership project between Environment Hamilton and the Hamilton Naturalists Club, and I'm with the Hamilton Naturalists Club. And we started in 2015. And really it all started because people started coming to me. I do a lot of urban conservation work, and people started coming to me saying, Jen, how can we help monarchs? Because I was at the time that everybody was really concerned about monarch caterpillars and monarch butterflies. So it was all about helping monarchs, and just the way the community was coming and saying, hey, let's work on this together. It wasn't just, hey, Hamilton Naturalist Club, go and make the monarchs come back and do good things. It was, we were being approached because people wanted to work collaboratively and collectively. So we started just by, you know, planting some native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers with the community in different, mostly at that time, mostly public parks. And that since then, the project has grown really organically based on what people are interested in, what they want to learn about, what they want to do. And every year it has grown since then. And we were fortunate to be able to have Bree come and help with us. So you'll hear about that in a minute. So some of the things that we're working on collaboratively is to get more pollinator habitat. So the idea is that I want a bee to be able to travel across the city happily. So being able to go habitat to habitat, that habitat could be a flower pot, it could be a big massive park, it could be things in between, but all of those things spaced apart so that a little tiny bee can travel between them. So we do that. So, you know, we do a lot of planting now on public and private lands, but we also give people the tools, and you'll see that in a minute as well, so they can create their habitat. So it's all of us working collaboratively in whatever space we have available to work in. We also work to spread awareness. So, you know, sharing this is what's happening. So it's gone way beyond monarchs. Now we're looking at, you know, pollinators as a whole, and looking at, like, this is a big issue that all of us can play a role in, and we can actually do something to benefit. And that's what is attractive to people. And looking at, you know, like, we have our pollinator goals where we're working on creating and maintaining habitats and getting lots of people involved. Well, this has led to a bigger and broader biodiversity discussion. So now as a community, we're working together to create a biodiversity action plan, because now people see, okay, we have this, but we can do more. Like, look how much we can do, and we can do even more. And the next slide. And so as part of this, we've worked to become a bee city. So this is a program that is now part of the Pollinator Partnership Canada, and it started in 2015 with Toronto becoming the first bee city in 2016. And this is an initiative that kind of just shows that the city has a love for bees and is doing things to help our wild bees, so our native bees that Bree was talking about. And we do this to create and maintain, improve habitats, sharing and educating the community and engaging folks in that work, and celebrating pollinators during the National Pollinator Week. So, you know, as a community, we were already doing these things. And so we wanted, you know, I wanted the city to be recognized for all these great things that we're doing. So in 2020, Hamilton became the 39th bee city. And this is a great initiative. It has really helped to bring the city on board with lots of great things. And we're doing even more work this year. It's fantastic to see the enthusiasm that this designation has brought. And this has led us kind of as a platform to jump from to do more of that broader biodiversity work. And the next slide. So a lot of this knowledge and education is being shared through our website. We've had a really great team of volunteers kind of helping us to take all the information that we've been collecting and putting it in one place that's easy to use and easy to access. We've learned that other groups use this information so that, because it, it can be applicable across Canada. So it's being used that way, which we think is wonderful. And we've worked really hard to have lots of really accessible information on the website. And work on just keeping on building that resource. So as if we're hearing lots of people have questions, we try to address those questions by adding more information onto our website. And then we'll see pieces of it. And then other ways that we can educate and that we connect with people is through our social media. So Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And again, just to share information about what we're doing, but as well as what others are doing. We don't need to do it all. There's some really great information out there. So we try to make sure that we share that information, as well as to celebrate what's happening in our community. And the next slide.
I'll take this one, Jen. So yeah, like Jen just said, one of the big things of being a bee city and part of this initiative is to spread native pollinator education. So one study coming out of the lab that I'm researching in at York University with Dr. Sheila Kola was looking at the general Canadian population's awareness about our native bees. And they found that about half of the people thought that European honeybees were a native bee. A lot of people weren't sure or thought that honeybees could replace wild native bees. So this was the kind of misinformation that we wanted to change and make people more aware of the diversity of bees and pollinators that we have in Hamilton and in Ontario and Canada. So in Ontario specifically, we have over 350 different species of wild bee. This is an infographic from our Pollinator Paradise initiative. And about 1 in 10 insect species actually face the risk of extinction, according to the UN Global Biodiversity Assessment. So there is very little funding for insect research, but it's one of the most diverse taxonomic groups. So there is not a lot of information about the historical populations of a lot of insect species. So we are hoping to increase awareness and increase funding so we can actually determine how many species are at risk of extinction. And to do that, we need to know where they are and how many of them there are and how that's changing over time. And so one of the great things that was done in the Hamilton Pollinator Paradise Initiative was we did a different bee species per day on social media, introducing different kind of bee groups so people could see what that diversity looks like of our bees. And this was done during the National Pollinator Week. So we'll just show a few of those here so people at this presentation can learn a bit more about our native bees as well. So one bee, the leafcutter bees, this is a group of bees that will actually use little pieces of plant leaves or flower petals to create their nests. So they'll line their nests with these materials and then they'll lay their eggs, and over time that will become the next generation of that bee. So if you see little holes that are circles or heart-shaped in flower petals or leaves, you can possibly assume that it is a leafcutter bee just trying to build its nest. Another bee type we have are carpenter bees. So probably you have seen or heard of large carpenter bees, which look a lot like bumblebees. They're big and black and yellow, and they're usually nesting in some kind of wood substrate in someone's backyard. But we also have small carpenter bees as well, like the Seratina here. There's 4 different species of this type of little bee in Ontario. And they nest in little pithy stems. This is some pictures I took of one nesting in some Virginia creeper in my backyard. You can see its little face poking out there. So another very diverse nesting material being used by this group of bees. And then there's also a squash bee. So when we talk about bees and pollinators, we can usually group them into being specialists or being generalists. So specialist bees require a specific type of flower or group of flowers that they really co-evolved with and rely on. Whereas generalist bees are the opposite. They can utilize a much wider diversity of flowers for food. Squash bees are a specialist that co-evolved with squash and gourd plants. And so they rely on those flowers for their survival. And in return, these crops really rely on these bees for us to harvest the food at the end. So if you do plant any in your own garden, do have a look for the little squash bees inside the flowers when they're in bloom. And this is one of the ground nesting bees. So about 70% of our native bees do nest underground in the soil. So this bee will dig a little tunnel and then have these little side tunnels where it will lay an egg in each one, and that will eventually turn into an adult bee for the next year. So this is kind of what it looked like. We had this on the website, and again, we had that on social media, showing people a different type of bee or group of bees every single day. Jen, you can go ahead.
So, so I mentioned that we worked through our education activities to give people the tools so that they can create pollinator habitats in their yards or whatever space they have available. And as part of this, we've developed a certification program that is, inclusive. We want to encourage people just to plant native plants in their garden. So we don't ask people to rip out their whole garden. Instead, we just ask, can you tuck some native plants in here and there in your existing garden? And in return, we'll recognize you through this certification program. So we ask people to look at, like, what kind of things can they do to provide for the habitat requirements of a variety of different pollinators. So some of the key messages that we try to get across through our education activities are to leave some bare soil and to not mulch everywhere for those ground nesting bees that Bree just talked about. We also encourage people to, leave their gardens messy in the winter and in the early spring, so they don't disturb the pollinators that might be nesting in the leaf litter and in the hollow stems in their plants. And then encourage people to plant a variety of native plants. We also help people to find, source native plants, and ensure that there is some kind of water dish that isn't a bird feeder, because we're talking about little insects, so they need a smaller water dish. So it could be something shallow that's filled with rocks, and that works. And then how do they maintain their garden? So we ask people to fill out all of this, and then get the sign. And this is an example of, some of, like, it sounds like a lot, but as you're filling it in, the form is very accessible, and people haven't had a problem with that. And people like the signs, and it's really interesting to drive around town and see more of the signs up. People have found that when their neighbors might ask, like, why do you have a messy garden? If they don't understand the gardening with native plants, having the sign really helps them to then educate their neighbors about what they're talking about. So there's been so many benefits from having this program and having this recognition. Also helps, as people are going through it, that in itself just helps to educate people about the kind of things that they can do to help pollinators.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through a toolkit that was created. So if somebody was like, wow, I'm learning about this project and this program, and I want to get involved and I want to start a pollinator garden or a pollinator patch, but I have no idea where to start. We created this toolkit so that people could go to this and they could see a step-by-step how to start your garden all the way through to how to maintain it year round. So I'll quickly go through that with you guys. I just need to stop my sharing and then reshare, I think. Okay, let's see. Okay, so hopefully you can see it. Someone let me know if you can't see it. They should have the chat open. Okay, we're good. So this is what it looks like on the website. Again, like everything else, you can find it on the website, and it's just something you scroll through. So these are kind of the contents, like a little menu page. So first we talk about pollinators and biodiversity and why we need to help pollinators, kind of what we just talked about here. And then our part 2 is actually the steps of planting. So you can click on one of these to jump ahead to that part of the menu if you're only interested in maybe learning about what kind of plants to use, but I'll just quickly scroll through. So again, this is talking about our pollinators and the overall biodiversity. Here they can flip through the different bee groups, and then why we need to help our pollinators and how they're declining, and how this kind of all tucks into supporting biodiversity in general. And then here we talk about actual steps to how to start a pollinator garden or a pollinator habitat patch. So the first thing is using native plants. And so we talk about the difference between having a native plant, a nativar, which is a cultivar of a native species that has been bred. Usually they are bred for things to make them look prettier, and in return, they might not have as good quality pollen or nectar or any pollen or nectar in them at all. So we really highlight wanting to use native plants, not nativars. And then of course, we don't want people planting non-native plants, and especially not anything that's known to be invasive. And so we introduce that, and then we kind of talk about the different steps to planting a pollinator garden. So the steps we have is choosing your site, and then how to design your garden based on your site, then choosing your plants, preparing the garden, planting it, and then maintaining it. So this is how you choose a site. So we talk about, considering the soil and how much water it gets and where the nearest water source is, and sun versus shade and things like that. And then we talk about designing your garden. So from the different plants and where to choose where your plants are, how to get them in the correct spot. This is kind of like the criteria we have for having a pollinator garden. So making sure you have nesting habitat, a water dish, things like that. And then these are some design tips and some little drawings that were made of what that could look like. And then here we have one, which I think is one of the most useful, because sometimes it's really hard to know what a good native plant species is for pollinators or in general. We have all of these different really great native pollinator plants that people can look through to see what they look like and learn about the names of them. And then we have how to prepare your garden. So how to remove all the weeds or whatever is growing there if you have grass. So we have 4 different methods that can be done to do that, to clear out that soil so that it's ready for planting. And then how to plant your garden. So we talk about whether you want to plant from plugs, little tiny plants, or if you wanted to actually plant from seeding, and 2 different ways you could do that. And then what kind of maintaining your garden year round looks like. We talk about how the first 3 years is usually kind of the toughest part to really help that garden get established. And then after that, it's a lot easier, and kind of what that looks like across the 4 seasons. And then here, which is super useful, is again, a really comprehensive plant list and resources. And we also have resources for where you could buy these plants, because sometimes it's really hard to go into, a garden center and know what's being advertised and if this really is a native plant. So we kind of compiled that for people here. So we have plants that prefer sun, partial sun, or shade. We have small and large trees, shrubs, grasses, and fern. So a variety of different plant types that we have. And then we also broke them down, especially for these flowering plants, into what time of year they flower at, because our pollinators are active over different parts of the spring and summer. Some are really active early in spring, and some are really active late in fall, and everything in between. So you really want to make sure you have something in flower or in bloom across all of those stages. So we have different plants that are flowering at different times, so people can easily go here and pick the flowers that will be in bloom at different times based on the conditions that they have and the availability of sun in their garden. So that's kind of the toolkit. And then again, we end with a little section on whether, if you just have a really small space and you can't plant a huge garden, if you just have a balcony to plant on, some tips on kind of maintaining and keeping a small, tiny pollinator garden, which is also super useful. So I'll go back to our slides. And so that was kind of the comprehensive toolkit. If you're really, a beginner gardener and you're not sure where to start, that's definitely useful. And then we have this 2-page PDF that's kind of like a condensed version of that, which is an easy handout or something quick and easy to read as well.
So, so we mentioned the certification program that's inclusive for everybody, and then we have the fantastic toolkit that Bree and some others put together that we were lucky to have, because it is a tremendous resource. And so that kind of gives people the knowledge. And then we set up our Monarch and Caterpillar Award program. So this is a volunteer-driven program that started a few years ago with some of our community leaders. So we have a few different kind of groups involved. So there's the Naturalists Club and Environment Hamilton, Royal Botanical Gardens, and the Crown Point Garden Club, as well as some community volunteers. And this is meant to celebrate the people that really go above and beyond to garden for nature. So our tagline is, you know, gardeners who love nature, and they're gardening for nature. So this is, you know, the people that work really, really hard. Some people have been doing it for decades. It's kind of fun to see that some people have kind of gotten into this in the last, since 2015, since we started our program. So our judges, our volunteer judges, have kind of broken things up into 6 different categories. And these are the things that they look through. So the process is you submit your application, we go through all of the applications and then whittle things down for the judges. And then the judges will actually go and do a site visit with the gardener. So the gardener doesn't need to live in the space, but they do need to kind of be in charge of the garden. So having like a landscaper come isn't really what we're looking for with this. And it's meant to be residential, maybe a condo if it's like the condo board looking after the garden, but it's not meant to be commercial at this point because it's completely volunteer driven. So the things that we're looking for are the soil, how do we maintain it? Water, how do you conserve water? Where do you get your water to take care of your plants? And for the plants, you know, do you have native plants? How many? What kind of species? Are they native plants or are they cultivars? And the materials and hardscaping. So for these other things, how sustainable were those decisions made? And what kind of cultural practices do you have? So what kind of other things do you do to be a sustainable gardener? And then it is a garden. It's not meant to be a wild habitat. So the judges are still looking for some aesthetics. Not to say there's anything wrong with like a wild look in a garden, but for this, they're looking for aesthetics because it is still a garden. And then a couple of years ago, because people were really getting into the program, we developed the Caterpillar Awards. And so that's for newbie gardeners, people who are just starting out. And we noticed, so for last year's Monarch Award program, we actually had more Caterpillar Award submissions than Monarch Award because so many people have started gardening with the pandemic. And we expect that to continue next year as well. So we had lots of families apply. It became a real family activity for their gardening, and which was a lot of fun, a lot of excitement from these Caterpillar Award winners who really appreciate the visit from the judge, because then the judges also give them tips and tricks. So last year, and then they have the rubric, right? So we have a few tools for them to kind of show that our volunteers put together this very detailed rubric to go through. So very detailed on each of those 6 categories that I mentioned. This is exactly what the judges are looking for. So you know, going into it, this is what they're looking for. So maybe your garden isn't there right now, but these are the kind of things that, you know, especially if you want to aspire to a Monarch Award winning garden, these are the things that you want to look for. So you could almost look at it, depending on your space, as like a work plan to work through. And then if you do get a judge to visit the garden, say, especially if you're like a Caterpillar Award winner, they basically what they do through the site visit is walk through the rubric with the gardener and then get some really good tips on moving forward. So these are just some of the resources that we have for folks. And then with the award winners, you know, we celebrate everybody. So if you meet the standard that the judges have set, everybody that year gets an award. So one year there might be 3, the next year there might be 20. So we're not picking like 3 finalists, everybody who meets the bar. And then normally we would have the awards given out in council chambers. So having the mayor hand out the award. We weren't able to do that last year, but the idea is that when we are able to do that again, that's how the awards are given out, which people appreciate. Okay.
So I'm going to, we had so many applications for the Monarch Awards and for the just certified pollinator gardens that we wanted to see what this looks like mapped out across Hamilton. So I'm just going to share a story map we made and walk you through the geographic data. Oh, wrong slide. Okay. So hopefully you can see my screen. So this is again linked on the main website, and this is a story map we put together with ArcGIS from Esri. So you can scroll through, it kind of quickly introduces the project if someone isn't familiar. This is what that garden sign looks like that Jen was saying you get if you have a certified pollinator garden that you can put in your garden. And then here we have the maps of the data and kind of showing all of our gardens so far. So this is showing how many gardens we've had over the different years. So we can see how this project is definitely growing over time. And then we talk a bit about what these gardens require. And then if you keep scrolling through, this is a map showing where the gardens are, and you can actually click on some of them that are in blue, and you can see what some of these gardens have actually included in their application. So sometimes they have a bee nest box, some of them actually included a detailed plant list, so you can see what some of your neighbors are planting to get ideas on what are some good species to plant. Some things like having bird feeders as well, because birds are also pollinators. So you can go through, you can see kind of some ideas of what some other gardens have been planting as well. And then this is showing the different types of gardens. So it's not just residential. Residential is a huge part of it, but we also have some schools, community gardens, corporate partners. We have, larger park plantings. So just showing the diversity of groups that can apply for a certified garden as well. And this is just kind of to show that we accept gardens of all different shapes and sizes. So some of them are huge, whether they're in a park space or somebody has a really big property and have made a really big pollinator habitat garden, whereas some people just have what they can fit on their balcony, and any of those count and the bees appreciate them. And then this map here is talking about the Monarch Awards and the Caterpillar Awards and what they're judged on. And what's really cool about this map is that if the winner of either of these awards submitted any photos, we had their permission to put some of the photos of their garden here. So if you're not really sure what these gardens look like or what they should look like if you're wanting to plant one, you can go through and actually see pictures of some of the award-winning gardens. If the picture is too small, you can click it and it will open in a bigger screen. So I think this is great to get people to actually be able to visualize just what these gardens might actually look like. And then our final map here is kind of a call to action that even though we do have 300 gardens across Hamilton right now, we're still looking for more. We really do want to increase that connectivity between these gardens so that, like Jen said, even a tiny bee can hop from garden to garden and have all the flowers it needs to survive. So in blue are where we really need more gardens. In yellow are areas where we do have a lot of gardens, but of course more is still great. So really a call to action for people that live or have a business or anything in this blue area to try and plant some pollinator habitat. And then we just finished with our toolkit in case somebody wants to see exactly how they could help after watching that. And then some quotes from our community members that have built a garden. Some of the cool ones are that we've seen more animals and insects in our urban yard than we have camping. I really love that one. And I'm looking forward to planting more native flowers next spring and summer. So kind of just bringing together exactly what this looks like across the city. And Jen, we're a little bit close for time, so just letting you know.
Okay. So here I just wanted to show some examples of some of the habitats that we've been able to create in city parks. And so we have, with the mural, that's one of our newest and biggest sites. And then where the picture in the middle where the students are planting, that was actually our first site. It's massive. And we do things a bit differently now, but that's an example. So we have like kind of formal gardens, and then this one in the middle is more of a wild space that people must not mind because the city hasn't gotten any complaints in almost 10 years. And then on the right, you can just see, like this was just beside a school, so some elementary school, and the kids helped us to plant. And this just shows that, you know, in the city, urban conservation is very different than, you know, what I look at in our nature sanctuaries. And, you know, I can make habitat anywhere. So that means anybody can do it, because it's just a little strip of land surrounded by concrete and it's working. Just kind of working on getting that connection between our habitats. And then we do lots of different types of education, because people have different things that they like, and different ways that they like to connect. So normally we would have native plant sales, might be able to get those going again in the fall. And we have different speakers come in, and blog posts, and our social media. And we've done bee box making. So we try to respond to what we're hearing from people and what they need and what they want. We generally do a designing your garden and gardening for native plants like every year. We also do an invasives workshop every year. And then, you know, how to maintain your garden and how to take care of it in the fall. So lots of different things. In the last year, it's been a bit different, but I'm hoping that by the end of this year, we'll be able to do stuff in person again, and just responding to what the community is interested in. And then, yeah, we share, like I said, like there are lots of great resources out there from lots of experts. Bree has mentioned a lot of them, and we like to share those. I love it when work is already done and that all I have to do is share it. Way easier. You know, we're already all so busy, so let's just be efficient. And if people have already done a great job, I don't redo it and put our logo on it. I just use it and share it as is. And that's a big part of what we do, especially like with plant lists and things like that. Just getting the information out there is more important than who owns that information.
Okay, I think we have time to share this video. It's just 2 or 3 minutes. So we'll quickly share a video one of our volunteers made that I just think is awesome. Just gonna make sure I'm sharing my sound. Share computer sound. Okay.
And why is it butterflies, moths, birds? You've heard of pollinators, but what is pollination and why is it important? Flowers produce pollen, which needs to get from the stamen, where it's produced, to the pistil, which contains the ovary. This is where pollinators come in. Plants need pollinators to move pollen between the flowers so that it gets to the right place. So, why is this so important? Almost 90% of flowering plants rely on animals for pollination. Most flowers need to be pollinated so that they can produce seeds and fruit, which gets eaten by animals who spread the seeds around. These seeds grow into new plants, which create the oxygen that we breathe, provide a food source and habitat for animals, and are the base of the food chain, harnessing the energy of the sun to sustain life on Earth. It is because plants are so important that our pollinators are equally important. The more pollinators there are, the more plants there are. Some pollinators and plants have special relationships, like the squash bee and squash plants. Squash bees evolved alongside squash plants. Like 70% of our native bees in Canada, they're ground nesting bees. They usually nest right under the squash and burrow one long tunnel that splits off into branches, which each get one tiny egg laid near pollen and nectar for nutrients. Squash bees are by far the most effective pollinator of the squash plant. They wake up at the same time that squash flowers open, which is important since squash flowers bloom for less than a day, and non-native honeybees tend to choose other flowers over squash plants. Pollination is vital to our crops. Without it, we'd have 34% less food. In Canada, over $1.2 billion worth of produce depends on insect pollinators. Next time you eat a meal, think a pollinator. The pollinators have been so good to us, but they have a problem. Their populations are declining. Habitat loss is one of the main causes for this decline. That's why the Hamilton Naturalists Club and Environment Hamilton started the Pollinator Paradise Project. Our goal is to create a corridor of habitat in urban areas so that pollinators have a food source and habitat in expansive areas where it can be difficult to find food and shelter. we also want to help you figure out what you can do to help pollinators. When many people throughout the city plant a wide variety of native plants, we support a wide variety of pollinators. So there's a huge potential for you to make an impact. And it's easy. Here's how you can use your garden space to help save our pollinators. Plant native species like goldenrod, milkweed, asters, wild geranium, Virginia mountain mint, and many more Carolinian flowers. Carolinian means native to the biological region we live in, which has a specific set of plants and animals. Pollinator-friendly trees like bur oak and white pine can provide important habitat for wildlife. It can also help to leave some bare soil for ground nesting bees. These bees aren't likely to sting since they aren't protecting a hive. And they can help keep your flowers growing year after year. Want to learn more about pollinators and the Pollinator Paradise Project? Visit our website at www.hamiltonpollinatorparadise.org. And next time you see a bee, beetle, butterfly, moth, or bird, say thank you.
Okay, so yeah, that's the end of the presentation, and we'd like to thank you all for listening, and thanks to everyone who's been involved in this project along the way, including all the people that are building the pollinator habitat across the city. Yeah, if anybody has any questions for us, you can ask in the chat or come on the mic.
Thank you so much, Bree and Jen. I'm just going to stop the recording for the questions session. So yeah, if people want